Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today I'll be analyzing the case of Ronald Bettig. First I'll look at the background of this case, move to the timeline of the crime, then offer my analysis. Ronald Valentine Bettig was born in March 1960 and grew up in the state of Michigan. His mother earned 2 doctorates and instilled the value of education in her son. Ronald earned a bachelor's degree from a college in California and later a PhD from a college in Illinois. He was hired as a professor by Penn State, which is in State College, Pennsylvania. He lived just 3 miles outside in the town of Lamont. Eventually, Ronald became an associate professor of media studies. He taught courses on the political economy of communications. Ronald was described as eccentric, nonconformist, deep, skeptical, and a conspiracy theorist. He despised the government, corporate media, capitalism, physicians, medical testing, and technology. He did not own a cell phone, believing it was a weapon of mass destruction. It seems like Ronald hated a lot of things, but he was a big fan of at least one thing: marijuana. Some of Ronald's students thought he was incredible and loved him. Others found him to be disturbing and called him a communist and a nutty professor. As far as his personal life, Ronald married and had a son and a daughter. This marriage ended in divorce. He married for a second time to a coworker named Jeannie Hall. They divorced in the late 1990s, but continued to maintain a close relationship. In 2011, Jeannie died unexpectedly from cardiac arrest at the age of 53. This loss was extremely difficult for Ronald. He became depressed, lost weight, isolated himself, and started to develop memory problems. The memory issues may have been unrelated to Jeannie's death. It appears as though Ronald had dementia. In the spring of 2015, he went on sabbatical. When he returned to teach in the fall, he was unable to do so and was placed on leave. Ronald spent a lot of time using marijuana. One time he allegedly purchased drugs outside a store called Choice Cigarette Discount Outlet in State College. After the drug deal, he went inside the store. An employee named George Ishler joked with Ronald about being more discreet when buying drugs. George had witnessed the transaction. The pair became friends as they both had an intense interest in marijuana. During the course of their conversations, George told Ronald about his niece, Danielle Geyer. He said that Danielle was having a lot of financial difficulties and was homeless. She had been married and had a son. Danielle lost custody of her son when she divorced. She found another lover and had a second son, but that relationship failed as well. Danielle was caring for her second son and wanted desperately to gain custody of her first son. Ronald had always been a champion for the underdog. For example, he would routinely help strangers who had lost employment. In early 2016, he allowed Danielle, her son, and her then-boyfriend to move into his home. Not long after this, Ronald kicked the boyfriend out. He caught the boyfriend using drugs. George was fired from the cigarette store after allegedly stealing a wallet that a customer left behind. He would hang around Danielle and Ronald quite a bit. The police would later refer to George and Danielle as known drug users. Ronald paid a lot of Danielle's expenses. Despite the 23-year age difference, the pair became romantically involved. Now moving to the timeline of the crime. On Monday, August 15, 2016, 56-year-old Ronald Bettig was reported missing by George Ishler. Here is what the police found during the course of their investigation. George and his niece Danielle said that on Wednesday, August 10, they made a 5-hour trip with Ronald to Rehoboth Beach, Delaware. The couple returned to Lamont on Friday, August 12. Ronald and Danielle stayed in Ronald's residence, and George went home. When Danielle woke up the next morning, Ronald was gone. George and his niece thought that maybe Ronald had moved to California. They also mentioned how he was depressed at the loss of Jeannie in 2011. On Wednesday, August 17, 2016, 2 days after Ronald was reported missing, the police found his Ford Focus sedan near an abandoned limestone quarry called the Blackhawk Quarry. This is located near the intersection of Lower Brush Valley Road and Remy Road in Potter Township, about 6 miles east of where Ronald lived. The police found water bottles, a flashlight, and a small rake at the top of an 80-foot cliff. After noticing vultures circling nearby, they found Ronald's body at the bottom of the cliff. The police determined that Ronald had probably traveled off the cliff on Friday, August 12th, 3 days before he was reported missing. Based on the height of the cliff, Ronald slammed into the ground while traveling at about 48 miles per hour. He sustained several fractures, including to his right arm, both hips, both femurs, and his jaw. However, his brain, heart, and lungs were still functioning after the fall. Ronald was not immediately killed. He may have survived for up to 2 days, ultimately dying from dehydration and blunt force trauma. It wasn't immediately clear if Ronald jumped off the cliff or if somebody pushed him. A witness spotted a woman with blonde hair and a man riding in Ronald's car on August 12th. Not long after Ronald's body was found, George Ishler contacted the police. He told them that he believed his niece Danielle may have been involved in Ronald's death. George said when they were returning from their trip to Delaware, there had been tension between Ronald and Danielle. Furthermore, he claimed that after Ronald went missing, Danielle had another man over to Ronald's house. The police spoke to Danielle about the accusations made by George. She denied any involvement and implicated her uncle. Here is the story that Danielle supplied to investigators. Ronald discovered that George had been using his credit card for unauthorized purchases. Apparently, Ronald allowed Danielle to use the card for certain things, but then George took it and made purchases that Ronald did not know about. The purpose of the trip to the beach in Delaware was for George to get money to pay Ronald back, but George was unable to get the money during the trip. Looking for another way to compensate Ronald, George offered him marijuana plants, which he had grown in Black Hawk Quarry. George, Ronald, and Danielle drove to the quarry on August 12th. Danielle stayed in the vehicle as George and Ronald went to collect the plants. George came back alone, and he and Danielle went back to Ronald's residence. Danielle became suspicious when she noticed that there was dirt on George's pants. She asked him where Ron was. George responded, quote, I killed him, and if you say anything about it, I'm going to kill you too, and I'm going to kill your son," unquote. Afraid for her life, Danielle did not contact the police. Instead, she helped George stage the scene to make it seem as though Ronald had jumped off the cliff by himself. They drove Ronald's car back to the quarry and left the water bottles, the flashlight, and the small rake near the edge of the cliff. This explains why the witness had only seen a woman and a man. The witness had spotted Danielle and George returning to the scene of the crime. The police went back to George and confronted him about Danielle's accusations. At first, George said that he and Ronald had been wrestling and Ronald fell off the cliff. This was just an accident, definitely not a murder. Later, George confessed to murder. He said that he killed Ronald, but Danielle was the primary driver. It was her idea. George said, quote, Danielle talked me into it. Danielle convinced me to kill him, unquote. The motive for the murder was money. Ronald found out about the unauthorized credit card purchases, which means his romantic relationship with Danielle was in trouble. Danielle was worried about being kicked out of his home. Furthermore, she was interested in Ronald's money, believing that he owned millions of dollars in Disney stock. In reality, he owned about $50,000 worth of stock. Danielle thought that Ronald had updated his will to include her, so if he died, she would get that money. On September 22, 2016, as a result of the statements made by George and Danielle, they were both arrested and charged with murder. On April 23, 2018, they were convicted of first-degree murder and a few other charges. George and Danielle received the same sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole. Now moving to my analysis. Here are my thoughts on a few areas that stood out to me in this case. Item number 1. As far as the guilt of George Ishler, there really isn't much doubt. Even though he said it wasn't his idea to commit the murder, George still confessed to committing the murder. He said that he and Danielle originally planned to drown Ronald during the trip to Rehoboth Beach, Delaware. George tried to pull him under the water, but Ronald was too buoyant. When they returned from their trip, they drove to the quarry, where George pushed Ronald over the edge of the cliff. George said that he heard a crunch when Ronald smashed into the ground. At the trial, George changed his story and said that Ronald jumped off the cliff sideways. So they were having some type of discussion. Ronald became argumentative and spontaneously jumped off the cliff. George explained his murder confession by saying he was just being sarcastic. This highlights yet one more pitfall of failing to master sarcasm, spending life in prison. Item number 2, Danielle made a better case for being not guilty than George, but her argument ultimately fell short as well. She claimed that she was unaware of George's plan to commit murder, and she only went along with the cover-up out of fear. The problem for Danielle is that the text messages between her and George suggested they started plotting Ronald's death on August 10, 2016. This is the day they traveled to Delaware. In one message Danielle sent to George, she wrote, quote, "So ready, I am blanked off," unquote. The blank rhymes with the word missed. George and Danielle wrote a will for Ronald to sign, which he did. If the will had been upheld, they both would have benefited financially. Danielle was desperate to get custody of her oldest son and thought the money would help her do this. Danielle's story about going along with the cover-up because she was threatened didn't really make a lot of sense. She was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Item number 3, what do I think happened in this case? This is just a theory, my opinion. Ronald Bettig fit the profile of a type of professor I have encountered several times during my career. He had beliefs that fit somewhere between left-wing and libertarian. He fought for the collective good, social justice, individual liberty, and limited government. Ronald also had a lot of skepticism about authority. He became a polarizing figure among his students for some of his more controversial views, like his affinity for communism, but was largely thought of as harmless. Ronald's unconventional personality left him in a tough position as far as maintaining personal relationships. He was estranged from his 2 adult children, and after his ex-wife died, he experienced intense loneliness. Ronald genuinely wanted to help Danielle, but he also wanted companionship. He probably did not invite her into his home with the intent of starting a romance. It's not clear what type of romance formed in this case. There were a few different stories. For example, George made a crude reference to the police, suggesting that Ronald had been seduced by the power of female genitalia. Ronald was desperate for sex. He would do anything for it. Danielle implied the romance had more of a transactional nature, like she was having sex with Ronald so he would pay her bills. Other people who knew Ronald didn't even realize he was in a romantic relationship. They were skeptical about this claim. They believed he was simply helping Danielle and no sex was involved. Regardless of the nature of the romance, when Donald started developing dementia, he became easier to manipulate. George and Danielle were able to take advantage of him, but they overestimated Ronald's gullibility. They thought he was more impaired than he really was. Ronald realized that George was making unauthorized purchases with his credit card. George and Danielle expanded their money extraction plan to include murder. Ronald Bettig spent his life questioning authority and hoping that his students would learn critical thinking skills. Ultimately, he failed to see a danger that was much closer to home. How is this possible? I think this happened because Ronald had dementia. George and Danielle took advantage of a man who was ill. It is as simple as that. I don't view Ronald's unusual beliefs as being connected to his death, although one could argue those beliefs facilitated him inviting Danielle to live in his home. It's worth noting that even people without extreme beliefs make that same decision all the time. Most drug users never plot to push people off cliffs. Ronald just happened to encounter 2 extremely dangerous drug users. Now moving to my final thoughts. This case involves an unusual personality type that appears to be overrepresented in academia. As I mentioned, I have seen a lot of professors like Donald during my career. Why does this happen? What is it about working in a university that attracts people like this? I think that people like Ronald are attracted to universities for a few reasons. The promise of intellectual freedom. Universities often welcome diverse viewpoints and encourage debating. It is an environment where being disagreeable has clear advantages. Teaching can be thought of as a form of activism, and universities offer a degree of autonomy. In my experience, these types of professors can be a lot of fun in the short run, but they tend to end up a little bit isolated and are often not taken seriously. These blow-up-the-system type guys are curiosities, but few people really want to blow up the system. They're pretty happy with the system. I think many students think of professors like this as a novelty rather than a role model. Those are my thoughts on the case of Ronald Bettig. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you soon.